Brothers and sisters, my name is John Vorstemans. I'm the General Secretary of the New Zealand section, and I've been given the privilege this afternoon to introduce our International President, Mr. Tim Boyd, who's the 8th International President of the Theosophical Society. He's also been in the job 8 months now. It seems that 8 could be a recurring figure. It's interesting, we've spent the last few days talking about change. And reflecting on this, when introducing somebody, I wonder if by talking about their past, we're actually inhibiting who they are in the present. Each moment defines who we are. However, I will give a little background from my research into our International President. As we all know, he is currently the President of the US section as well. I found it interesting that he has co-produced, narrated and conducted interviews for Eternal Quest radio services, which have been broadcast in the United States and Canada. He's a founding member of a Theosophical spiritual community in central Chicago, in a deteriorating part of Chicago, or the urban area of Chicago. And as part of this group, he developed organic gardens and vacant lots, worked with at-risk and disadvantaged youth, placed beehives on roofs of buildings, something we really need today. I had a look on Quest Books, and there's over 30 CDs and DVDs available as Tim as the author. In 2007, Tim became the head of the TOS in America. And one of the first efforts was a fundraising campaign for the Golden Link School in the Philippines. And Tim's involvement in the TOS and an orphanage in Tibet led him to an audience with the Dalai Lama. This resulted in the Theosophical Society in America sponsoring the Dalai Lama's visit to Chicago in July 2011, an event which raised around $400,000 for the educational projects aiding Tibetan communities worldwide. With those words, I will hand over the podium to our International President, who's speaking on the present need.
I'd like to thank our chair, the General Secretary from New Zealand, John Vorstemans, for the glowing introduction. I listened to him and I find myself quite impressed with myself. But you can't believe everything that you get off of the internet, I need to warn you. But it's very good to be here at this close of the convention. Obviously, this is the first convention which I have served as the international president. One of the responsibilities of being the international president is that you are in fact present at every talk that is given. And that's something that I have found has been something of a blessing to me. If I'm going to confess, in past years when I was at the convention, when my body became a little tired and my mind became a little overloaded, from time to time I might miss a talk where I would lay down to get some rest. In my new capacity as president, that is not something that I either want, or it seems also that I just don't get tired now. So what I've had an opportunity to be exposed to is the same thing that you have, which has been some very probing and profound thinking about this vital subject to all of us as individuals, but to us specifically in terms of our theosophical and spiritual life, which is to say the subject of change. It's one of those things that if we do not figure out some sort of way to embrace it creatively, then like so many things, we end up being just washed to the side. Yet another thing that came, went, and soon is forgotten. So to me, this has been quite an inspiring time. I hope so for you. Today, what I would really like to talk about is just to share some ideas. We'll see what directions we end up going with this, but some thinking toward this present moment, some thinking toward what might be the need that we can first recognize and then that we can respond to, that this moment presents to us, the opportunity of this particular time with our particular stage of development. If we track it back to the early days of the Theosophical Society, its founding days, what we name as theosophy is something that was largely given to us. And the source of that was predominantly through the medium of H.P. Blavatsky. It was through her that these words were given and these teachings were outlined in such a way. The work that she did was certainly a difficult one. It involved all levels of functioning that a human being could be asked to do. She lived without much ever in the course of her lifetime, without much in the way of riches, and yet she was able to participate in the founding of something which has grown, finds roots in 70 countries of the world, has resources that stretch from financial resources to resources of land to its most important resource, which is 26,000 people who have found some meaning and some value in this thing called theosophy. She was a person who was not suffering from any illusions as far as the acceptance that she would receive for the work that she was doing during her lifetime. Fortunate that she was not suffering under those illusions, because during her lifetime she found rejection, accusation, all of the various sorts of things that would stop normal people in their tracks, but to which she was willing to continually, as mad as she got, as angrily as she spoke, to pick up and try again. But one of the things that she did say was that the world to which she was speaking was not the world to which these teachings were being directed. That really their understanding would have been impossible. And what she said, that it would not be until the 20th century that the teaching she gave as theosophy could begin to be understood. There was a certain growth that had to take place in the human scene. One of those primary growths, of course, has been the growth in the scope and the depth of scientific worldview, which we'll talk a little bit about that. So the theosophy that she presented and the movement that began through her efforts was one that was directed toward a future. From the indications that I see, and from the world that I find myself looking out on today, I find that in many ways it seems as if that moment is now. That the possibility for these life-affirming, expansive, these teachings to take root in a way that is meaningful to the world at large is this moment that we live in now. So that's something that perhaps I'd like to explore during our time that we're here together. Right now, there's an expression. It's an African expression, but it's probably something that you find in cultures all around the world. The way that I know it, it says that the disease that is hidden cannot be cured. The disease that is hidden cannot be cured. So, at least briefly, I'd like to examine some of the currents that perhaps form some of the greatest obstacles to the full expression of this theosophic worldview. Also recognizing that wherever we find obstacles, we necessarily find opportunities. In the world today, there's a particular way of seeing the world that seems to have evolved over the past 400 or 500 years. It's something that has become so all-encompassing that we don't notice it, but it's something that seems to guide our every decision and which has become really worldwide in its scope. And it has its roots in what we could call the contemporary view of science. The scientific worldview is one that is, for all that we may think of it as being an eternal fixture of human living, it's something that is relatively new. 400 to 500 years ago, the particular way of seeing the world that we describe as scientific was relatively unknown. It has evolved, and it has taken a particular form in this evolution that is affecting us very, very deeply. Largely today, what many people describe as science is also described using other terms. The terms that are used to describe it are reductionism, or either materialistic reductionism, or reductionistic materialism. You take your pick. It's something that speaks about a narrowing of view, a reduction of view, pointing it toward a perspective that is materialistic. At the time of the TS's founding, you find in the Maha Chohan's letter that comments about the state of the world. And one of the words that is used, he speaks about brutal materialism as something that needs to be addressed in the world of the 1880s at that time. This worldview that has been embraced and that has been promoted is a view that is reductionistic because what it does is this. By definition, the scope of consideration for contemporary science is the material realm. So the cosmos, as examined, as observed, as experimented, is strictly and only the physical realm. So thinking of that which is divine is not measurable. Consciousness is not measurable. Its effects may be, but consciousness itself is something that has been excluded from this worldview. So it's one of those things that has had a very severe limiting effect. That wouldn't be such a difficult problem were it not for the fact that, in reality, this narrowed scientific view is one that has become the dominant worldview in the sense that it is almost now the religion of the world. In any government in the world, when it comes to establishing policies for its peoples, science is requested to weigh in and provide its answers. One of the difficulties with a view that looks toward materialism and the physical world as the total universe is that we find ourselves in a condition now that has never before existed. There has never been a time in human history where the cosmos, the inner and outer universe within which we all function, has been regarded as anything but sacred. That's no longer the condition. It has been described as a desacralized cosmos. And this has implications because the main way that we tend to arrive at our various sorts of decisions about anything we do is impelled by certain values. Values that we have cultivated that are based on what we know, what we believe, and what we experience. These values have been diminished. A further stream that has coalesced with this stream of reductionism is another one that had its roots 500-600 years ago. And perhaps it was something that really got kick-started during the time of the Protestant Reformation. So in Europe, where in previous times the church, as in most places, the temple had the final say. With the tumbling of that sense of center and value, Luther, who began that whole movement, set afoot something that has spread abroad yet again. It's not something that has isolated itself to the West, because it's just as active these days in India, it's coming to China, and it's engulfing the world, which is this idea of, it's beyond just individualism. Because I think individualism is part of the natural cycle that we have found ourselves in, the natural spiritual cycle. That cycle in which the individual, either in opposition to or in recognition of the environment within which we live, is able to establish their own core and to operate from this central core. In its ideal form, it's something that the individual develops this core so that in the course of this process, it can then be turned over as conscious service to the whole. But what we find has developed has been a misshapen and I would say mistaken take on a basic concept, which you find ingrained in the Declaration of Independence in the United States. Probably even you all might be familiar. As someone who grew up as a student in the schools in the US, you had to learn this stuff by heart. And so now I'm able to repeat it to you just like any parrot might. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. That's women too. You also are equal. And because my wife is in the audience, I would have to say you are more than equal. I have to go home. So all men are created equal, which is something that is a profound statement if it's understood from the level at which it is said, which is to say that in terms of our divine qualities, in terms of our divinity, every one of us is equal in that we share from the same source. There is no separation, there is no division. Equality even fades as an idea because it is one. There's nothing to be divided to compare. It's equality. But the way this idea has become translated has become twisted. So there are, in fact, in the world, great beings. There are people in this world whose wisdom, whose experience, whose knowledge, whose education, whose development far exceeds the norm. We all know this. And yet, we find ourselves at a stage where all men are created equal. Why should I listen to this person when I'm equal to him? And it's a mindset that perhaps we don't find so active in ourselves, but it's certainly active in the world. In the early days of the Prophet Muhammad's work, one of his followers at the time was spoken to, and the same idea was promoted. What's so great about Muhammad? He's a man just like any other man. And the response of this wise person was, the prophet is like other men in the same way that a ruby is like that stone on the ground. But the quality of recognition of these inner qualities is something that we have to revive. Somehow or another, it has a way of slipping away from us. So you have these two trends. The reduction, the materialistic reduction of our worldview that seems to have coupled itself with an individualism that really is self-centered individualism. And now this has become an active trend in the world, and it's productive of certain consequences, obviously. And the list of those things is long. Excuse me. Probably I would only be repeating what you have heard from other speakers who have said it more ably during their time up here. But there are a host of crises in the world that we are all having to face. And it's something that has become so pronounced today, given the fact that media is so widespread, and given the fact of internet connectivity, that something that happens across the world, we know about here almost instantaneously. I had an email from a friend yesterday. He's in Chicago. And he emailed me concerned about news that he had heard about a flight that had taken off in Indonesia that was headed toward Singapore, and I received the message in India. Welcome to the 21st century. So this is the level of connectivity that we have. So our impact, one upon another, has the potential to be greatly magnified. But part of the problems that we see around us, anyone who's bothered to pick up a newspaper or look at a news report will know that we have this thing called global warming, climate change. In most countries of the world, you're experiencing something like deforestation. The deserts of the world are growing at a rapid pace. Water supplies are being challenged. The earth, the air, the water is being polluted at an alarming rate. And everywhere we turn, 64 countries in the world, 600 different levels of wars are going on as we sit. These are just facts, simple things, but quite complicated. So this is the world that we're living in, and these are the problems that we will address. These are the problems that if we choose not to, then we will experience consequences, and we will pass those on to future generations. So, one of the problems that we find is this. I'm going to share with you two quotes. One is a quote from Albert Einstein. Another is a quote from H.P. Blavatsky, which was read to us by Els when she was talking. I should say first that of all of these different problems that we are facing in the world, every single one of them, without having to develop some new theory, without having to delve more deeply into some new technology, there are solutions that are available now to every one of these problems. All of them. The knowledge required is here. So that should cause us to ask a question. If, in fact, these problems are here, they're quite visible, the knowledge is available for their solution, why aren't they solved? Why do they persist? It would seem that however great our knowledge might be, that perhaps knowledge isn't good enough. A little bit too small for big problems. So something else that exceeds mere knowledge seems to be what is required, and seems to be also what the point of the Theosophical Society's founding was about. So anyway, the quote from Einstein you're probably all familiar with. It says that no problem can be solved on the level of consciousness at which it was created. No problem can be solved at the level of consciousness that has created that problem. Another way of putting it is, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish. You got it. We don't know. We swim in an ocean of a particular narrow band of thinking and emoting, and we think of it as the real world. We're those fish, and we just don't know. The quote that Els shared with us from H.P. Blavatsky was about the world. In answer to a question about what is the world is man living in his personal nature. So really there's similar sorts of quotes. What we perceive as reality, what we perceive as the real world, is merely this reflection of our collective personal natures on display. This is the world. But it's a world that we're seeing has very clear limitations that need to be addressed. I have used the example recently about the limitations of knowledge. At the level that a problem is created, you take any particular problem, we can take the example of the various sorts of wars that are going on around the world. Wars, violence, terrorism. What's the solution that we apply today? I think we all know. Where there's violence, the solution is greater violence. A violence that is perhaps so extreme that there can be no response on that level. This is what we imagine to be a solution. Obviously, the history of the world demonstrates it doesn't work. But that doesn't mean we don't keep trying. And basic logic would tell you, if you do harm to the loved ones of another, if perhaps you destroy those lives, on more than one level it doesn't work, because the daughters and sons of those people do not feel kindly toward you. It does not create a peace that's lasting. From the theosophical point of view, the other thing that occurs, this sort of rapid and sudden deaths that occur in war, the body dies. The instrument that may have been acting in violent ways dies. But the consciousness doesn't disappear. The consciousness goes on to become a part of the pervading atmosphere the ocean within which we fish are swimming, and it's a consciousness that is tagged, that is marked by fear, that is marked by anger, that is marked by hatred. This is the solution to peace? It just doesn't work. We can even apply a similar idea to our approach to something such as our spiritual study and our spiritual path. Most of us, very often we find ourselves attracted to the pursuit of the spiritual. Often it comes because we find that within ourselves there's an intense sort of suffering that we experience. We suffer in different ways. I mean, for some people it's physical, for others it's emotional, for some it's in the mind. But suffering's universal. And when we start to find that perhaps there's some glimmer of hope along this line of spiritual practice, how do we approach it? It's said sometimes that the very root problem, at the root of all of the problems that we face, is one more fundamental than the other. And the fundamental problem is one that we have a profound ignorance. A profound ignorance. I find myself sometimes, there's the classic example that is used to speak about the nature of our ignorance, which is to say, our problem isn't that we don't know different things. We know a lot of things. The problem with this sort of fundamental ignorance is that not that we don't know, but that what we know and what we see is completely wrong. And the example that's often used is of the man walking along the pathway and he sees a coiled rope in the road. And seeing this rope, he thinks it's a snake, and his heart starts beating. He gets ready to run. Everything related to snakes and the fear of that is what occurs to him because this is the reality that he perceives, which is wrong. At that point that he realizes it's a rope, it changes. I have to say, I always thought of that as it's a very good example. But for someone who grew up in New York City and then lived in Chicago, you walk down Broadway in New York, you don't have much fear of snakes. So it was one that I could understand, but it's not really one of those ones that kind of hit home for me. Until I came to Adyar. I should say, just so my wife doesn't get frightened, it's not because I saw a snake, okay? But I can say I was walking from my house to eat, and it was evening time. It was a little bit dark. And I remember walking in the road, and I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. But in that kind of half light, things look awfully different. And I found myself walking, and there, somewhere up ahead of me in the road, there was something that looked like it was coiled. And without even thinking about it, I sort of started to walk to the other side of the road until I got there and, of course, found it was a leaf or a branch or something. But now, when I use that example, now it has real meaning because it's a part of me. But that's the example with that. That's what ignorance is. So when we approach our ignorance, what's the approach that we often take? Very often we feel as if the approach to alleviate this sort of fundamental ignorance is we need to study more. And so we pick the right books. And after we finish one, we probably need to study another, and another, and another, in the hope that there is some sort of a quantitative level to this qualitative shift in consciousness that we're pursuing. It's the same idea. When the world is a material world, then the answer to the problem is more. More. Something needs to change with that. part of this idea of the environments in which we live, Annie Besant told a very interesting story that happened with her. She was going to Chicago. She was on a train. She was half asleep when all of a sudden some heavy sense of gloom and despair awakened her. She hadn't come into Chicago yet, and she didn't know what was going on that caused this sort of feeling in her, because it was not her normal sort of response. But then she realized Chicago at that time was the slaughterhouse to the world. Animals by the millions were being slain. And she realized that what she was feeling was this environment, this overarching atmosphere that breathed out from this city. In those areas where you had those sorts of activities going on, it was well known, many sociological studies were done, to find that the crime rate was much higher in the neighborhoods of those slaughterhouses. And that very often, the crimes that were committed were with the very sorts of weapons that they used in the slaughter industry. But just to say, on this level, the atmosphere that we live in affects us. We know that. In the Bible, there are many profound things that are said. A lot of them come in very short sorts of sayings. One of them, which is quite powerful, speaks about the above version of this below experience. That we live, we move, and we have our being in the divine. That every moment that we breathe, every moment that we live, our entire being is immersed in this divinity. And that the remembrance of that is something that has a certain sort of power. So in this world today, we have these sorts of problems of a global scale. And we find ourselves having to think about, what do we do about this? How do we address this? A.P. Sinnett, one of the early Theosophists, the one who received the letters of the Mahatmas, he wrote a number of books, one of which was a book called Esoteric Buddhism. And in that book, he talks about traditional teaching methods. That's to say, the methods for occultism, for the spiritual life, and what those traditional teaching methods were. I like the way he says it. What he says is that the traditional teaching methods impressed every new idea upon the mind by a certain process. And that process was, his words were, by provoking the perplexity that this new idea ultimately relieved. It's a nice way of saying that the learning experience in terms of the life of that person who commits to a spiritual path is really largely about the progressive creation of crises. And it's as true for us as individuals in our own cycle of unfoldment as it is for this planet. We find ourselves now in a period of a planetary crisis, a perplexity that has been provoked by a certain line of thought, narrow line of thought, that has been pursued by now about as far as it can go. And the fresh idea that is to be impressed upon the mind of humanity is an idea that is fresh only in the sense that we are just now ready to come to it. Because obviously it's as old as humanity itself. And this is the idea that there is the possibility for an expression of, for the experience of oneness, unity, brotherhood, in the many ways that that can be applied. So for us, as Theosophists, within the Theosophical Society, how do we move beyond this particular stage that we find ourselves? This stage where we are rich in knowledge but poor in solutions? The first thing I think is to realize that knowledge in and of itself will not be enough. And that there is something that has been called throughout the ages as wisdom. And that it's not something that is the sole possession of great ones who live outside of our realm, but it's something that by its very nature is part of our own makeup. In Buddhism and in the Voice of the Silence, HPB talks about the paramitas, the perfections, of which the final one is prajna. The greatest of those perfections is what's called prajna, or wisdom. And it's said that each of these perfections is an antidote to various conditions of mind, conditions of heart. So patience, which is one of the paramitas, is an antidote to anger, to violence, things like that. But it's said that wisdom is the antidote to every possible ill that there is, and that a little bit of a realization of wisdom is sufficient to alleviate many, many problems. And what is wisdom? Kim Dew spoke about it. We all refer to it. And referring to it is about the best we can do, because really we don't. We don't know. We could describe it as that which is the perception of that which is real. It's something that is not foreign to us. I share a poem with you. It's a poem about a man's experience. It was written by one of the great poets of the English language, who was also a member of the Theosophical Society, a man by the name of William Butler Yeats. When he was 50 years old, he had a particular experience that happened. Very brief, but also very profound. And he described it in a beautiful short poem. And it's an experience that I think probably all of us can relate to. The poem goes, "My 50th year had come and passed. I sat a solitary man, an open book, an empty cup upon the marble tabletop, while on the street and crowd I gazed, my body of a sudden blazed, and 20 minutes, more or less, it seemed so great my happiness that I was blessed and could bless." It's one man's experience of a descent. We speak in terms of buddhi. We speak in terms of the intuition. The 20-minute experience of this blessed awareness was something that was life-changing. I think for all of us there has been some measure of this. Maybe you didn't get your full 20 minutes. Maybe it was just a brief moment where, for whatever reason, thoughts about yourself disappeared, and in that vacuum, something came to fill it. Looking back on the experience, you might have called it a wonderful moment. You might have said, "I was happy." You might have said, "I was peaceful." But the basis of that experience was that in some way or another, often unconsciously, we had a moment where the gnawing, crying voice of self-grasping died away for a moment. And it's enough to live a lifetime. This is an intimation of the sort of wisdom that Theosophy speaks about. Again, to quote from the Bible. As I say, I've said this before, I tend to quote from the Bible when I'm in India, from the Upanishads when I'm in America. It seems to work. The Bible seems to be quite exotic when I use it here. But there's a psalm that also describes this same sort of experience. Just one brief line from it says, "He utters his voice," and he being the voice of the divine. "He utters his voice, and the earth melteth." The earth melts. In those moments that most of us would identify as the realest moments in our lives, are those very moments when the seemingly solid earth disappears from view. And we find ourselves encountering something profound. Something that defies our later descriptions, but yet we still try to describe. This is the basis for this is the basis of the answer to this present need. Whatever it is that you know will not be enough. Whatever your specific talents will not be enough. Whatever you have in terms of finance, resources, will not be enough to meet the need that is upon us. But whatever it is that you have, whether it's a grain of sand or whether it's $1 million, when it is touched by the blessing of this consciousness that is within all of us and that we have all experienced to some degree, then it becomes transformed. That's the transformation that takes place. That's the need that's before us. What we have to do at this point, we have to learn how to live at our limits. All of us feel as if we are limited beings to some extent, and we try and confine ourselves within these limitations, never straying too far. How do you know where your limits are? Because at the point where perhaps you find yourselves with people you don't know, and you start to become uncomfortable, you become aware that maybe this is a wall that I was not aware of. Where you see sufferings of various sorts and start to again feel uncomfortable, and maybe this is something I should turn away from. Recognize there a wall. Where you start to sit in your meditation practice, and this day, unlike other days, some sort of sense of a profound peace starts to invade the borders of your consciousness, and you quake at its approach because you don't know what it might hold for you. A limit, a boundary. These are the places where we have to learn to live. Because what we will all find is that to the extent that we approach these limits, they ever recede. None of them are confining. And we develop in our capacity to face the very next. There's a need for something that the Theosophical Society came into being to provide. The means we find within the hearts of each and every one of us. Nothing is missing. Nothing is lacking. Nothing more is needed. So what I would just ask for each and every one of us, the compass that we apply to our living needs to be a reliable one. The tools of science, the tools of our various fields and talents are useful in their application, but the only clear point that will guide us is your own experience of that which you have perceived as profound as true. So I would ask it for all of us in facing the ever-present need of this world that we refer continually to that, because that is in fact what links us with one another. And that alone will bring solutions that will lead us to the next turn in this cycle for the growth of humanity. So, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim, for sharing with us. And I know for me that the boundaries are where it's at. I'd like everyone to show their appreciation to Tim. Looks amazing from here. And with that, I close this meeting. Thank you.